fall in love with yourself. I honestly, I look forward to looking in the mirror. I look forward to making videos. I look forward to taking pictures. I have thousands of pictures of myself now. I love myself so much. And it's such a good feeling. Take the time to care for yourself, to be there for yourself, to help yourself as much as you help anyone else. Love yourself. Grow to love yourself. It's all a process.
All right. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Ray. I am a detransition male, and today I'm going to be talking about autogynephilia, and particularly this example because this is like just so paradigmatic, so classical. What is autogynephilia? When you break it down into its constituent parts as a word, it means love of oneself as a woman. Clearly, this person, this trans woman, is in love with herself. This is a classic example of how autogynephilia has both a paraphilic dimension that is more fetishistic that you see in the transvestic fetishes. We've all seen those pictures of the creepy transvestites, wearing prostheses and all these things, and that sort of gives off this vibe that AGP is purely paraphilic, purely fetishistic. It has, you know, yeah, and that's what you often hear from like the gender critical side, the extreme gender critical side, where they're very anti AGP. They just see it as total perversion, total degeneracy, total fetish, total paraphilia. There's nothing else going on except a pure sexual arousal, and all motivation in regards to the psychological processes of autogynephilia are entirely reduced to these incredibly fetishistic and paraphilic dimensions of the phenomena. But since the inception of this research, Ray Blanchard noticed that there's both a paraphilic dimension and more of a romantic and a more romantic and emotional attachment side. And this was brought out very, very well by Anne Lawrence, who is a transsexual woman herself, who is self-identified autogynephile, who wrote the book Men Trapped in Men's Bodies. And she also wrote, I can't remember the exact name of the paper, but it was something like Becoming What You Love. And she sort of used this analogy of, you know, how steamy, hot, passionate, you know, relations with like someone you're dating. When you first start dating a woman, it's like very passionate, very steamy, very erotic. But then like 30 years later, you've been married and you still love them, but it's more on the emotional romantic side. And you're not necessarily like super like turned on and aroused all the time, but you still have this deep love and attachment. Well, Anne Lawrence likened that to the process of the autogynephile going from where it often starts out in the more explicitly erotic and fetishistic side of things, but then as you go on hormones, you start this transition process, and the narrative identity, the autobiographical self of this female persona that gets built up in the mind. As that female persona gets constructed in the mind over this process, as this transition goes on, then you start to unlock these more emotional attachment side of things where you are basically in love with yourself. And we see this very clearly in that video that I showed, or that clip that I showed at the beginning of the video. That trans woman was clearly in love with herself, taking thousands of pictures of herself, staring at herself, looking at herself in the mirror, looking forward to looking at herself in the mirror, looking at yourself in the mirror and feeling warm fuzzy feelings, the same sort of warm fuzzies you'd see if you looked at your loving wife after 30 years or whatever. you know so this is clearly a case of autogynephilia in the more romantic emotional side of things. It's not all about the erotic. Now, I do think the erotic, the sexual aspect of this makes up a large portion of this phenomenon, but there is a good contingent of trans women who aren't walking around constantly aroused at the thought of themselves as a woman, but they are walking around in love with themselves as a woman. They're walking down the street. They glance at the reflection in their mirror. They see themselves, warm fuzzies. They're not getting aroused. They're feeling the warm fuzzies. And so we see this romantic emotional attachment, which makes sense on Phil Illy's model of this as autogynephilia being a what happens when normal heterosexuality somehow there's a logical error in the brain, some sort of cognitive misstep, such that you have this attraction to something, but then your brain goes, "Oh, I'm attracted to this, but the thing I'm attracted to, I also want to be that thing." Um, so I'm attracted to femininity, but then the brain is like, "Well, what if I was feminine myself? Maybe I would like that." So it's like this inversion process. And I wanted to show this clip because autogynephilia gets demonized so often as just being purely paraphilic. And I think that demonization is why so many trans women are reluctant to take on this label. But I think as long as we understand that autogynephilia comes in a range of presentations, some presentations are strictly transvestic fetishistic. That's usually what you see, the bad behaviors. But on the other end, I think there can be cases of autogynephilia where there's almost very little fetishism, very little eroticism, and almost entirely on the emotional romantic side. And then there's cases where you have, kind of a good mix of both. And then there's cases where you start off on the fetishistic side and then you transition and you sort of move and develop toward the more romantic emotional side. So there's wide varieties of possibilities here with this concept. But I wanted to show this clip because it perfectly illustrates the emotional side. And also, this whole idea that the trans community is constantly pushing out there that, oh, it's transphobic to talk about autogynephilia. It's bigoted to talk about autogynephilia. It's pseudoscientific to talk about autogynephilia. This has been debunked. This has been, and clearly it hasn't been debunked because clearly we see classic examples of this as a phenomenon over and over and over and over and over. And the other thing I want to point out is that um, trans women, the trans activists, like to always say that, well, autogynephilia, love of oneself as a woman, that's just normal female sexuality. They're like, oh, well, of course, a woman would imagine herself as a woman in her sexual fantasies because trans women are women. So it's natural to expect a trans woman to, be turned on at the thought of herself as a woman because she's a woman after all. This is just normal female sexuality. But I think if we really pay attention closely to what's going on at that clip at the beginning of the video, we will see that this is a uniquely male phenomenon insofar. Well, I want to bracket that because I think there are possible cases of females having autogynephilic psychological experiences, but I would say that's a minority. Sorry, that is not normal female sexuality because that's the claim. Because what that trans woman experienced, that is normal for trans women, but that is not normal for females. Because females aren't falling in love with themselves by staring at the mirror and taking thousands of selfies. That's just not normal female sexuality. Female sexuality is more relational. It's social. It's attracted to the other person. It's about finding like a provider for and yeah, it's more allo. It's more other oriented. It's not so self obsessed. And I also want to say that I don't think that this is necessarily this self-love, that this like falling in love with themselves. I don't think it's strictly narcissistic. I don't think that this type of self-love is the same type of self-love that we see in pathological clinical narcissism. I think that's a distinct phenomenon. They're analogous insofar as it's self-referential cognitive process, but the way in which you relate to yourself is totally different. In the autogynephilic emotional attachment case, the self-referential cognitive processing is more, I don't know, it's more romantic. Whereas I think the pathological clinical narcissist isn't really like romantically in love with himself. Um it's more about having an inflated sense of oneself, an inflated sense of of one's importance and grandiosity, and like and how important you are as a person to, like, you know, what's going on in the world. So that I think is different. And also that demand for validation, that, you know, everyone else acknowledge how great you are. I think that's more on the classical narcissistic side, whereas I think what we see in the autogynephilic case is slightly different. So, okay, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Take care. Bye-bye.